Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. This session here today is all about just sharing with you our journey to Workspace. And for that, well, we have a very important, very special customer here from Randstad, Belgium, who is going to really share their journey from A to Z. So let's get started. I would like to present to you Peter Knuppens. He is representing the IT department from Randstad Belgium, and we have worked with him and his team for a few years now. And just a quick introduction about myself. My name is Karen Castelli. I am the EMEA change lead at Devoteam G Cloud. So I have helped Peter here and his team with the adoption of Workspace. Now over to Peter. We will be talking about a couple of things. First of all, about the decision about why Google. Why would they even get started with that? He'll also share with you their journey from A until, well, not Z, but until today, until the day of today, of how they have embarked on this Google journey. He'll be sharing some of his challenges, some of his team's challenges, but also their journey into adoption. Last but not least, what would he have done differently? These are a couple of things that he'll be sharing with you today. So over to you, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Karen. So indeed, I'm Peter Knaapkes from the ICT department from Randstad Group. We are a special client. Don't know what that means, but happy to find out. I'll get started with why we decided to go with Google. The when is the next thing, but some years ago, I think it's already 10 years ago, we decided to leave our very old and obsolete Lotus Notes as a mail client. Well, A, because it was becoming very old. B, because it was not very easy to use, and the Google Gmail interface was a lot easier, a lot user-friendly, and the pricing was also an important part of that decision, given the fact that, well, we didn't call it cloud back then, I think, but at least it was not on-prem, so you didn't have to buy the hardware, the iron, so to speak, yourself, so it was much more flexible. So these were the main reasons to make that switch. Our journey, how did it look like? Well, we started, as I said, some odd 10 years ago, I think, in 2012, when we moved from Lotus Notes to Gmail. Back in those days, we only used Google strictly as a mail client, so all the rest of the gimmicks we did not use. Those were opened for early adopters. It started with the ICT department and quickly spread it out through the company. I think it was 2014 somewhere. When we then quickly scaled up to broaden the use within the company, but it was not mandatory. So most of the majority of our people kept the Windows environment as their main collaboration tool. And some of the early adopters and early Bs, so to speak, they started using Google Drive and Google, what was called G Suite back then, I think. Until somebody in the Randstad holding decided that we would go Google to the max. What that meant was that everybody should be using Google for whatever collaboration you needed. That was started 2016, 2017, but in the Belgian OPCO, we only took it on in 2018 on what I call a hobby basis. So we didn't really have dedicated resources for it, and neither a financial plan for it. So it was a bit on our own until we decided that, well, that wouldn't work. So we involved a partner. I heard Hans say in the previous presentation, well, hire partners, so we did. And that was back in the day, it was Forecast. And they helped us put up a plan on how to, deploy, but what's more important, to implement Google as a real tool within our organization. That was started, I think, 2019, late 2019. And then, of course, everybody knows 2020 brought us something very special called COVID, which forced people from one day to another to work at home. But all the negativity around COVID, it bought us a platform to launch Google, because people understood that Google as a collaboration tool offered a lot of opportunities and a lot of advantages over Windows as a collaboration tool. The ease of sharing documents between people, that really was a breakthrough. And at the same time, we launched Chromebooks as an end-user device, which, of course, Chromebooks, well, they don't have Office on board. So that helped as well. So that stepped up our game. And we also started the migration, the real migration. That meant to migrate all the file shares. I think we had a couple of terabytes to migrate from the Windows file shares to the Google shares in some form. So that was done. And in parallel, we had what we then called a remediation track, where we looked into all the different ways people were using either Word or Excel or PowerPoint, and to help them transition in using the Google equivalent of those tools. That's where we more or less are today. Important to understand is that we are in what we call a hybrid situation, because we as Randstad decided to become a Google company, but the rest of the corporate world hasn't yet. So that means that a lot of our important clients, but also smaller clients, especially in Belgium, they are afraid of Google, they don't trust Google, they don't want to use Google. So they ask us to send documents in Microsoft extensions. The government, for example, signing documents with the government tenders, for example, is usually in a Microsoft version of documents. So you are still mandatory. So that means that a larger part of your population will still be using Microsoft. So that's something we need to live with. So that means that we have two standard end-user devices, the Chromebook for the majority and the laptop Windows device for a smaller part of our population. On the horizon also, and I'm pressured for a date, is the move to one domain. That means we have Randstad.com as a large domain, and we have a separate domain in our Belgian OPCO, as has every OPCO. And so we are migrating to one domain, reluctantly for the moment, but that has some reasons. What's also important is that in parallel with all the migrations to the Microsoft, to the Google world, we also looked at our management, at our data, because Excel is excellent at storing data, but you don't have any control on what is stored. Excel is misused as a database by everybody, especially accounting and finance. And what we did is we started also a data management track. Our CIO, Günther Geisels, he did a podcast on it, which is available somewhere. Karen can explain where. So if you have any interest in that, that's also something that we are doing parallel with our workspace migration. So what were our challenges? In the beginning, when we used Google just as a Gmail, the one challenge was that people are used to using their Windows credential, and all of a sudden they had to use another set of credentials to open their mail, which of course led to some confusion left and right. That is now solved because we switched for all our major applications to Auth0 as an authentication tool, which uses Google as identity store, so that has been resolved. So we now have what they call a single sign-on feel all over. So now they're using mainly their Google credentials and very marginally their Windows credentials. What was also a challenge is that, back in the day on the Windows, you could do whatever you want with your file share, so we had really a growth in documents. I think our ICT department was one of the worst students in the class. We had 1.2 million documents on our file share. Nobody ever knew why and how, but they were there, so migrating was quite a challenge. Also pressure from the group. Holding wanted everybody to go Google to the max as fast as possible, better yesterday than tomorrow. So that was something. And of course, a special challenge is the Citrix environment, which is not really Chrome friendly, so to speak. Then the Chromebooks, they in themselves were a challenge as well. In a consumer market, I think the Chromebook is a very able device, but for corporate, it's a bit lacking. Our demands are quite higher. We want a stable platform for our end users, which experience told us a Chromebook at the moment is not really. Every Chrome OS version gives us smaller and bigger nightmares. In the beginning, we had a lot of issues with the Wi-Fi connection on the Chromebooks, and still have to some extent. So that was a challenge. And also the support that Google gave was very cumbersome. You have to have a support team to support the support you get from Google. They're opening and closing tickets as you speak. They ask at very inconvenient timings, loggings, etc. So that's very cumbersome. That's something you need to keep in mind. And I hope that the Chromebook matures, because the Chromebook in itself as an end user device is a very able device. From a security standpoint, it's absolutely magnificent. We have no security issues whatsoever with the Chromebook. So from that standpoint, it's a very able device. And I think it's corporate ready, but it needs that stability. Then the adoption is also a challenge, because people are hooked to Microsoft. They have the habit of using a tool, and then taking away that tool and giving another is always a challenge. But that's not only Google related. I think that's in general. The great advantage of Google is that it changes and adapts quickly, but that's also a disadvantage, because your end users need to keep up with that pace. And that's not always simple. It requires a lot of communication, a lot of tips and tricks you need to throw around, and keep people really up to pace with the fast-changing environment. Another challenge, as already stated, a lot of our clients and partners, they just don't use Google. Some of them even prohibit the use of Google. We have some clients where a simple hangout is not possible due to blockings on their network even. So that's a challenge. And of course, the big shadow ICT. Google is very easy to use. Scripting is very open. You can link documents, you can build small tools on it very easily. So that's also a challenge to keep that in check, and to keep your end users in check. We have had a lot of Google wizards in our company. Some of them left, leaving behind some unmanageable tools where you have to re-engineer. Not you, Hans, I know. So, to give a quick roundup, these are the elements that we focused on during the adoption. So being reactive, that means be very responsive to the needs and the requirements of your end users. Have some Google ambassadors or Google champions or whatever you call them, so that people have a very short line of communication with somebody that can help them with very small issues at hand. How to put something in bold can be a challenge for some people. If they have a Google ambassador, they don't overburden your service desk with these kinds of questions. Also challenge the way we work. It's not because you use Excel and that you used to use Excel then that it's the best or most efficient tool. You have to challenge the flows, you have to challenge the processes, the way people worked yesterday and how they will be working tomorrow. Of course, COVID-19, as I said, helped us a lot in convincing people that Google was a very handy collaboration tool. And then, of course, the Chromebook, with all their disadvantages, they also offered advantages, because it's a very accessible device. It's very easy of use once you get used to it. What does that hybrid environment look like? These are very recent figures that we've drawn from our Google environment. MS Office is still used by 40 and something percentage of our population. Mainly Word and Excel, mainly because, well, for example, our legal department, in exchange with legal counsel, they usually tend to use Word documents. Why? Because, well, most of our lawyers still use them. And it's very cumbersome to always translate them into a Google Doc and then retranslate, especially for the exchange with contracts, etc. It's very cumbersome. Excel is still used mainly by our business intelligence and our accounting department, due to some very big files that just can be easily transferred into Google Sheets. So that's absolutely something you need to keep in mind, that hybrid environment is something that you will have to maintain for quite an extended period. What would we have done differently? Well, at least with regards to the Google deployment. The first and most important thing is, and that's something that we adapted for our most recent ICT projects as well, is to involve our end users at a very, very early stage to get the exact requirements, the exact acceptance criteria from them, to know what exactly they need, what exactly they want, and to give them ownership of those requirements. That has the advantage that it's very transparent and clear what they are getting in the end, but also you have some very early adapters and very early ambassadors on your side, which can be very good advocates or champions of your project. The inventory, that was quite a challenge to have an exhaustive inventory of everything that was done in MS Office. It was quite an extensive list. We did several iterations with all our departments in workshops, in several workshops, and still once we were ready to pull the plug on MS Office, left and right things popped up. Oh, I still use Excel for this or that. Some of them were easily remediated. Some we had to leave and, well, give them Office back. So that's quite a challenge, especially in larger companies where, well, there are a lot of departments, a lot of ways of working. Well, start earlier, that's not always the case. If you have a long period, then you can go slower, then you can have some iterations. I think if we would have had one or two more iterations, I think we would have less of a challenge with that inventory and with the remediation track. But well, time is not always what you have at hand. Time is money, as always. So, but if you can do it slow, do it slow. Then the Chromebooks, I already indicated that the switch to Chromebooks was in the beginning quite painful due to that Wi-Fi disconnection. If people are working from home and their Wi-Fi doesn't work, that's a disaster, and that overburdens your service desk. If in our service desk you mentioned the word Chromebook, that still has an impact. Right. Any questions?
I have a question. So, in your adoption strategy, can you go a few slides back?
I can.
Yeah.
This one?
Yeah. So here you have mentioned being reactive. So
Yeah.
Why wasn't it proactive then reactive?
Yeah, well, I think instead of reactive, it should be responsive, what mentioned here. Because proactive is always better, but as I said...
No, could you repeat the question for the live stream?
Oh, sorry. So the question was, why not being proactive instead of reactive? Well, I think reactive should be responsive. And I agree. That's why one of the lessons learned is to involve our end users earlier. That's part of that proactive thing. And to get that inventory absolutely exhaustive. I think that's one of the most important things. And to try, and that's not always easy, to be before the question, to see how other companies, what issues they had with regards to end users. Usually, end user issues with the transition to Google start very small. As I said, they don't know how to put things underlined or in bold or whatever, these very simple things, and that's something you can remedy with webinars, with small tips and tricks, with learning paths on your learning platform, all these kind of, but it should always be a combination. But I agree, reactive should be proactive and responsive to questions that come from your end users.
In addition to what you, Peter, was saying, what they've implemented at Hunstead that works really well is that they have these ambassadors who are also informing people about updates.
Yep.
Because they happen a lot. And so having that sort of support system, so it's taken out of the IT support team,
Yeah.
basically. Yeah?
Yeah.
We have people who are leading this initiative in-house and keeping their colleagues up to date.
Yeah.
And I think you guys are even subscribed to the beta.
Yeah, we have some users that are
Yeah.
subscribed to the beta version, and we have a very narrow collaboration with our learning and development team. So we exchange knowledge. So that means that everything you find on the ICT portal references to their platform and vice versa. And that's very important. If you make this an ICT only thing, then it's due to fail, because we don't get that link, that liaison with our end users as a learning and development department does. So they are always onboarded. We have the new features are communicated to us, and we communicate. Well, at that stage, learning and development is already involved, so they start working on tips and tricks. We have tip of the week, tip of the month. That is distributed on our intranet. So we have really a live community of people that are following up on Google and new features. If there's a really cool new feature which is really handy, which is really adding value, then we broadly communicate it to everyone. Yeah. So you have to have that network of communication of end users that are really involved. That really helps a lot. Yep, correct.
I have one question. You were telling that you are migrating all your, from Microsoft to Google.
Yeah.
Okay, you have faced lots of challenges. So, how much of, what was the challenge, like, which was a very big challenge for you, particularly in Randstad, your supportive staffs or, the employment staff. So, what sort of biggest challenge they have, faced, while migrating from Microsoft to Google?
Well, the question is, what was the biggest challenge in migrating to Microsoft to the Google? Well, there are several challenges depending on the department. The larger part of our staff works for Randstad as really staff. They do staffing, they do HR solutions. Their main challenge was that they were very afraid of losing documents. They had a very extensive archive on their file share of documents of all kinds of types. And their biggest fear was to never find a certain document again. That was their biggest challenge. So we had to reassure them that those file shares would be frozen. We would never throw anything away. And that reassured them that if in case they should need a document of X years old, it would still be somewhere available. That was their challenge. For our finance and other departments that extensively used Excel, the challenge was on a very deeper level. They really needed to change the way they worked on several levels. On the data management, because, well, Excel was not the tool to manage their data. That was their challenge. And then to switch to another tool, because they were used to making macros and etc. in Excel, and now they had to adapt to AppScript or Google Sheets or Data Studio, and that was their biggest challenge. And that took a lot of iterations to help them and support them, and still some of them are still not convinced that Google is the best tool, but that will come in the end somewhere. But that's the challenge, yep. Any other questions? Going once, going twice? No? Okay. Thank you.